My name is Mara Whitcomb. I am 32 years old. On Saturday, the 14th of October 2023, my brother-in-law threw an 18-page power of attorney packet across my mother's dining table, leaned over the apple pie she had barely touched, and said, "Sign it, Mara, or I'll put you in the hospital before your mother finishes that glass of water." My mother's hand started shaking so hard the ice clicked against the rim. That was the sound I remember most. Not Brock Hale's voice, not my sister Tessa's little sigh from the corner, like I was embarrassing everyone by refusing to be threatened quietly. The ice. 3 small pieces tapping glass in the house. My father spent 27 years paying off one union paycheck at a time. Brock stood between me and the kitchen doorway with his shoulders squared, his wedding ring flashing under the yellow light above the table. He was 41, 200 pounds of contractor muscle and borrowed confidence, the kind of man who believed a raised voice counted as leadership. Behind him, Tessa crossed her arms and looked at me as if I were the problem. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she said. My mother, Lorraine, sat at the head of the table with her cane hooked over the chair beside her. 8 months earlier, a stroke had stolen the strength from her left side and left fear in places pride used to live. Now Brock had dragged that fear into her own dining room and set it beside her plate like another serving dish. I looked at the papers, then at my mother, then at Brock's hand, already flexing like he wanted an excuse. He thought I was just a rehab tech with an old Subaru and a soft voice. He did not know about the 11 years of jiu-jitsu. He did not know about the boxing gym behind the YMCA. He did not know my father had once taught me that some people do not stop at the word no. But to understand why Brock thought he could threaten me in front of my own mother, I need to take you back to the morning the phone rang at 5:42. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. The call came from Glenn Pritchard across the street. Glenn was 72, retired from a machine shop, and the kind of neighbor who noticed things without making you feel watched. He knew which porch lights belonged on at night. He knew which mailboxes emptied by noon. He knew my mother never left her kitchen curtains open before sunrise. "Mara," he said when I answered. His voice was low, careful. "Your mom's back door is cracked open, and the kitchen light's been on." I knocked. She didn't answer. I was already reaching for my keys. February in Cedar Rapids has a way of making the whole world feel made of tin. The air cut through my sweatshirt when I ran to the car. My windshield still had frost along the edges, but I didn't wait for the defroster. I drove the 14 minutes to my mother's house, with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. Her house sat 2 blocks off Ellis Park, a narrow white ranch with blue shutters my father had painted the summer before his heart gave out. The porch light was still on when I pulled up. The back door stood open by 3 inches. I found her in the kitchen, sitting sideways in the chair by the breakfast table, one slipper half off. Her left hand curled against her lap like it belonged to someone else. A dish towel lay on the floor. The coffee maker had finished brewing, but the pot was still empty because she had never gotten far enough to pour it. "Mom," I said. Her eyes moved to me. Her mouth tried to form my name. What came out was broken, soft, wrong. I had spent years helping stroke patients relearn how to stand, swallow, grip a spoon, and turn fear into repetition. But nothing in a clinic prepares you for seeing your own mother trapped behind her own face. I knelt in front of her and kept my voice steady, because panic is contagious. "Smile for me, Mom." Only one side moved. "Lift both arms." The left one barely rose. I called 911 at 5:59. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. Glenn stood at the end of the driveway in a flannel jacket, hands shoved into his pockets, watching without saying a word. At St. 20 Luke's, they called it a mild, ischemic stroke. as if the word mild belonged anywhere near a woman who had taught first grade for 34 years, and now had to fight through tears just to ask for water. I called Tessa at 6:18. She answered on the fourth ring, breathless and irritated. "What's wrong?" I told her mom had a stroke, and we were at the hospital. There was a pause. Not fear, calculation. "I have a showing at 9, she said. "Text me updates." Brock didn't respond until 12:43. His message was exactly 2 lines. Hospitals always overreact. Don't let them scare her into some expensive rehab program. They bill old people for everything. That was it. No. Is she okay? No. Do you need me there? No. I'm coming. I sat beside my mother's bed that night in a vinyl chair that stuck to the back of my legs. The fluorescent light hummed above us. Her blood pressure cuff inflated every 20 minutes with a tired mechanical sigh. I wrote medication names on the back of an old grocery receipt because I didn't have a notebook yet. By morning, I had a notebook. By the 3rd day, I had learned the schedule of every nurse on the floor. By the 6th, I knew how to help my mother stand without pulling her shoulder, how to count her steps without making her feel counted, and how to hide my fear when her left foot dragged. Tessa came once. She brought flowers from the hospital gift shop and took a picture with Mom, while Mom was too tired to smile properly. She posted it before she reached the parking lot, with a soft filter and a red heart under the caption, "Family always shows up." I stared at that sentence on my phone, while my mother slept with her mouth slightly open, and one hand gripping the blanket, like she was afraid the bed might move without warning. Then I turned the screen off and went back to labeling her pill organizer for the week. Morning, noon, evening, bedtime. 4 small plastic rows holding together a life that had cracked open before sunrise. That was the first week I understood something my father had known long before he died. In our family, showing up had never meant the same thing for Tessa and me. Fairness had always been a strange word in our house. Tessa was allowed to be fragile before I was old enough to admit I was tired. She could arrive late, cry at the table, forget birthdays, quit things halfway through, and Mom would soften around her like wet clay. I could carry groceries, fix the pantry hinge, remember the insurance deadline, and somehow that was not kindness. That was just what Mara did. Nobody clapped for the steady child. They leaned on her, then told themselves she liked the weight. Tessa was 6 years older, and that gave her pain seniority. When she slammed doors, Mom said she was overwhelmed. When she wrecked Mrs. Harlan's mailbox at 17, Mom held her in the driveway like the mailbox had attacked her first. The year I won a regional science scholarship, Mom missed the ceremony because Tessa had a breakup that required the whole house to lower its voice. I learned early that my disappointment was supposed to be practical. Tessa's disappointment got a room, a blanket, and someone sitting beside it. For a long time, I believed that needing less made me easier to love. I became useful the way some kids become funny or pretty. I knew where Mom kept the spare checks. I knew which circuit breaker controlled the back porch. I knew Dad's blood pressure pills had to be refilled on the 3rd Thursday. If something leaked, expired, cracked, or needed explaining, people called me. And every time I answered, some small part of me hoped someone would notice I had never been asked whether I wanted the job. My father noticed. Dennis Whitcomb was not a loud man. He fixed power lines in January, came home with cracked knuckles, and washed his hands at the kitchen sink until the smell of copper wire and wintergreen soap filled the room. When I was 15, the deposit for my science camp became Tessa's healing weekend after another boyfriend left. That night, Dad found me in the garage, sitting on an overturned paint bucket, pretending I was not crying. He sat on the concrete beside me and said, "Being strong doesn't mean everybody gets to use you." Years later, when a boyfriend grabbed me hard enough in a grocery store parking lot to leave fingerprints above my elbow, I told Dad I was fine. He looked at the bruises and did not argue with the lie. He drove me to a small jiu-jitsu gym behind the YMCA and introduced me to Coach Anika Rhodes. Dad did not say I needed to learn how to fight. He said, "You need to know your body belongs to you." That sentence stayed longer than the bruise did. When Dad died, the house changed temperature. Mom got softer around the edges. Tessa got louder. I became the person everyone called when something broke, leaked, expired, or needed explaining. In Dad's old electrical notebook, tucked between a sketch of the basement wiring and a receipt for porch paint, I found one sentence in his blocky handwriting. "Don't let anyone turn your mother into a signature on a piece of paper." I thought grief had made him dramatic. I did not understand that one day, that piece of paper would have Brock Hale's name typed neatly across the top. Brock's name did not appear all at once. Men like him rarely begin with the grab. They begin with concern. They begin with a tape measure, a sigh, and a sentence responsible enough to survive being repeated in front of other people. The first time he walked through Mom's house after the stroke, he did not mention power of attorney. He stood in the hallway, tapped the wall beside the bathroom door, and said, "This place isn't set up for someone in her condition." Then he looked at me, as if I were the condition he meant. The house was a narrow white ranch, 2 blocks off Ellis Park, the kind built when hallways were small and kitchens were designed for one person moving between the stove and the sink. Dad had paid it off 7 months before he died. I still remembered him standing in the driveway, with the mortgage statement in his hand, pretending the wind was making his eyes water. To Brock, none of that mattered. He saw old plumbing, uneven porch steps, original cabinets, and what he called trapped value. He said it twice in one visit, like he wanted credit for knowing the phrase. At first, he framed everything as safety. The bathtub was too high. The basement stairs were dangerous. The porch needed rails on both sides. The kitchen floor dipped near the refrigerator. Some of that was true. That was what made him dangerous. Good manipulation always carries just enough truth to make resistance look unreasonable. I had already made the bathroom safer, ordered a shower chair, and moved Mom's bedroom downstairs. Brock ignored all of that and talked as if I had left her sleeping on a ladder. Then he started talking numbers. Mom's house, according to a valuation he printed from some real estate website, was worth around $312,000. Her retirement account and savings added up to about $186,000. The 6.4 acres outside Palo that Dad had inherited from his uncle could bring another 94 if sold clean. Brock spread those figures across Mom's kitchen table one Thursday afternoon while she sat with her cane across her lap, blinking at the paper like the numbers were moving too fast for her to catch. "Dead equity," he said, tapping the value of the house with his knuckle. "That's all this is. Dead equity sitting inside old walls." Mom looked toward the living room, where her framed class pictures still hung in neat rows. 34 years of first graders smiled out from behind glass. Children with missing teeth, crooked bangs, handmade Christmas sweaters. Some of them were grandparents now. She had taught half the town how to read, and Brock was standing in her kitchen calling her home dead. Tessa sat beside him, nodding slowly. Not because she understood the math, because she liked the sound of someone else taking charge. She had always mistaken confidence for competence, especially when it came in a man's voice. "Mara, you work hourly," she said. "Brock handles real numbers." I looked at Brock's watch. It was silver, oversized, and scratched along the clasp. His company logo was embroidered on his polo. Hale Premier Renovations. The stitching had started to fray around the H. A person's story leaks out through the things they think no one is watching. By June, his visits had a rhythm. He came after lunch, when Mom was tired enough to agree with almost anything if it would make the conversation end. He opened cabinets without asking. He checked window locks. He took pictures of the roofline from the driveway. Once, I found him in Dad's old office, running his thumb along the edge of the desk, where Dad used to draw wiring diagrams on yellow legal pads. "What are you doing in here?" I asked. "Assessing," he said. "For who?" He smiled without warmth. "For the family." That was Brock's favorite hiding place. The family. Not Lorraine. Not Mom. Not the woman whose name was on the deed. The family. A word big enough to cover theft if you said it with your shoulders squared. I did not know yet about the failed flip in Marion, the contractor liens, or the private loan keeping his company breathing. I only knew that every time he walked through my mother's house, he touched it like it already belonged to him. And every time Mom looked uncertain, Tessa reached for her hand, just long enough to make the pressure look like comfort. Tessa's hand on Mom's hand became part of the performance. She used it the way some people use a Bible on a witness stand. A gentle squeeze at the right moment. A lowered voice. A look across the table that said, "See? I'm the soft one. Mara is the difficult one." She never raised her voice when she started working on Mom. That would have been too honest. Tessa had learned long ago that guilt did more damage when it came dressed as concern. She began calling every evening around 7, just after Mom's blood pressure check and before the news. At first, the questions sounded harmless. Did you do your exercises? Did Mara bring dinner? Are you sleeping okay? Then they shifted half an inch. Is Mara letting you decide anything? Does she make you feel like a child? Do you ever worry you're keeping her from living? That last one was clever. It sounded like sympathy for me. It was not. It was a door Tessa opened so Mom could walk herself into shame. My mother had spent 34 years standing in front of classrooms, teaching small children that letters made sounds, and sounds made words, and words could open the world. She had been needed in a way that gave her dignity. After the stroke, needing help felt to her like a private humiliation. Tessa found that bruise and pressed it every night. One Tuesday, I came over with a container of low-sodium chicken soup and found Mom sitting at the kitchen table without the television on. That was the first sign something was wrong. She liked the 6 o'clock news because she said the anchors still dressed like adults. Her cane leaned against the chair, but her hands were folded in her lap, tight and small. I set the soup on the counter and asked if she was in pain. She shook her head. "Am I keeping you from having a real life?" she asked. There are sentences that do not sound loud when they enter a room but leave damage behind them anyway. That was one of them. I wanted to tell her about the shifts I had given up, the appointments I had moved, the vacation request I had deleted before submitting it. I wanted to tell her she was not a burden. I wanted to tell her Tessa had planted that question in her mouth. Instead, I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly so she would not feel surrounded. "You are my real life, Mom," I said. She looked away first. That hurt more than if she had argued. Brock's voice started appearing in Mom's words. Not all at once. That was not his style. First she said assisted living might be more practical. Then she said the house was too much for one person. Then she asked whether it was selfish to keep money sitting in walls when family could use it better. That phrase did not belong to her. My mother said couch, not sofa. Pocketbook, not purse. Supper, not dinner. She did not say money sitting in walls. Brock did. The first time I heard it, I was folding towels in the laundry room. Mom stood in the doorway, gripping the frame with her good hand, repeating the sentence like she had rehearsed it. I kept folding, because if I stopped, she would see my face. "Brock only wants what's best," she said. "No," I said, keeping my voice low. "Brock wants access." Mom flinched. Not because I yelled, because I had named the thing everyone else was trying to soften. That evening, Tessa called again. I stood in the hallway outside Mom's bedroom, close enough to hear my sister's voice through the old wood door. "Mara means well," Tessa said, sweet as syrup poured over glass. "But she likes being needed. You know how she is. She's always had to be the responsible one." I stood there with Mom's clean nightgown folded over my arm and felt something in me go still. Tessa was not defending Brock by accident. She was building a case in our mother's tired mind. By the time Brock brought the papers, he wanted Mom to believe I was not protecting her. He wanted her to believe I was the cage. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 41% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. The papers did not arrive with Brock, carrying them through the front door. That would have been too simple. They surfaced on a Tuesday morning, half hidden inside my father's old printer, the one in his office that still made a grinding sound before every page, like it resented being useful. I had come over before work to change the batteries in Mom's blood pressure cuff. She was in the living room, reading a church bulletin with her lips moving softly over the announcements when the printer coughed once from down the hall. At first, I thought it was another recipe. Mom had started printing low-sodium casseroles from websites she did not trust as much as the Methodist cookbook in her pantry. But when I pulled open the tray, a page was jammed crooked under the roller. Someone had printed it from Mom's laptop, the one Tessa still knew the password to. The ink had smeared across the top line, but I could still read the title clearly enough. Durable Financial Power of Attorney. Under that, in neat black type, was my mother's full name, Lorraine May Whitcomb. I stood there with my hand on the paper and felt the room narrow. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition. The kind you feel when a sound in the dark finally becomes footsteps. I eased the page out slowly so it would not tear. The document named Brock Andrew Hale as the proposed agent. Not Tessa. Not me, Brock. A man whose name was not on the deed, not on the bank accounts, not on a single birthday card my mother had saved in her cedar box. The powers listed underneath were written in that calm legal language that makes theft sound like office work. Manage bank accounts, sell or mortgage real property, transfer funds for care-related expenses, enter contracts on behalf of the principal, delegate authority as needed. Each line sat there clean and polite, wearing a tie, pretending it was not a hand reaching into my mother's life. I took photos of every page with my phone. My fingers were steady. That scared me more than shaking would have. I did not storm into the living room. I did not wave the papers in Mom's face and demand to know what Brock had told her. A frightened person will defend the person who gave them a simple answer, even if that answer is a trap. I folded the ruined page exactly as I found it, cleared the jam, and stepped back into the hallway. Mom looked up from the bulletin. "Everything okay?" she asked. I smiled, the kind of smile caregivers learn when the truth is too heavy to hand over all at once. "Printer jam," I said. "I fixed it." Then I called Nadine Mercer from my car. Nadine had been my mother's friend for 20 years, a retired church secretary with silver hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of voice that could make a potluck committee confess to murder. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then she said, "Honey, you need an elder law attorney before Sunday." Not eventually, not when things calm down, before Sunday. By 3 that afternoon, I was sitting across from Owen Delaney in an office above a dental clinic downtown. He wore no expensive suit, just a navy sweater, reading glasses, and the tired expression of a man who had seen families turn love into paperwork too many times. He read the photos twice. Then he set my phone down carefully, as if the screen itself might bruise. "Did your mother ask for this?" he said. "Or did someone decide she needed it?" I looked at the framed certificate behind his desk. I looked at the rain tapping against the window. I looked anywhere except at him. Because the answer was already sitting between us, with Brock Hale occupying the space where my mother's choice should have been. By the time I left Owen Delaney's office, the rain had stopped, but the pavement still shone like glass. I sat in my Subaru outside the dental clinic, with both hands on the steering wheel, hearing his instructions repeat in my head. "Do not accuse Brock in front of Mom without a witness. Do not let any document get signed. And if Brock put his hands on me, do not minimize it just because he was family by marriage." 3 days later, Brock was waiting in the driveway. It was late afternoon, the kind of cold October light that made every wet maple leaf look varnished. I had just opened the passenger door to grab Mom's refill bag from Walgreens when he stepped out of the garage. He did not call my name. He did not pretend to be friendly. He just planted himself between me and the back door, with his hands hanging loose at his sides, like he had rehearsed looking calm in a mirror. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. His voice was low enough that Mom would not hear from inside. That was the first thing I noticed. Bullies understand volume. They know exactly when to roar and when to whisper. I took the paper bag from the seat and closed the car door with my hip. If you mean the power of attorney, I said. Mom gets independent legal advice before she signs anything. His jaw shifted once. You went to a lawyer? There was no surprise in his voice, only insult, as if I had broken a rule by asking someone outside the family to read the trap he had brought inside it. He stepped closer, close enough that I smelled coffee, peppermint gum, and the sour heat of anger. You don't know what you're doing, Mara. You stretch old people for a living. I manage assets. He reached for the bag. I moved it behind my leg. That was when his hand closed around my wrist. Not a grab meant to stop me from falling. Not an accident. His thumb pressed down against the small bones until a bright line of pain ran up my arm. My body did what training had taught it to do. Distance, angle, breath. I knew the direction that would break his balance. I knew how little force it would take. I also knew my mother was somewhere inside that house. Through the living room window, behind the thin curtain, I saw Tessa. She stood with one hand, lifting the fabric just enough to watch. I waited for her mouth to move. One sentence would have been enough. Brock, let go of my sister. Or even, what are you doing? But she said nothing. She watched the way people watch rain from a warm room, close enough to see it, far enough to stay dry. Then she let the curtain fall back into place. Something inside me went quieter than anger. Brock left a bruise on my wrist. Tessa left something deeper, an empty space where my sister used to stand. I broke his grip with a small turn, not enough to hurt him, just enough to remind both of us that his hand was not a lock. I stepped back and kept my voice even. Don't touch me again, he laughed, rubbing his fingers like I had offended him by escaping. Or what? He said. You'll stretch me to death, physical therapy girl? I did not answer. Men like Brock collect reactions the way they collect tools, and I was done handing him anything useful. That night, after Mom fell asleep, I pulled my sleeve back under the kitchen light. 4 marks had started to darken around my wrist, small and purple, spaced exactly where his fingers had been. I photographed them beside the date on my phone screen. Then I opened the hall closet, reached behind a stack of winter blankets, and took out the brown jiu-jitsu belt I had not worn in almost a year. I laid it on the table beside Owen's card and the photos of the document. For the first time in months, everything in front of me looked like evidence. The brown belt stayed on my kitchen table for 3 days. I did not wear it. I did not touch it. I let it sit beside Owen's card, the photos of the power of attorney, and the picture of Brock's fingerprints blooming purple around my wrist. Evidence changes the temperature of a room. It makes ordinary things look different. My coffee mug, my mother's refill bag, the old table I had bought at a yard sale for $30. Everything seemed to be waiting for the next move. Tessa made that move on Friday afternoon. She called while I was leaving work and used the voice she saved for church ladies and real estate clients. Mom wants everyone together for lunch on Sunday, she said. Not I want, not Brock thinks, Mom wants. She had learned to put our mother's name in front of her own intentions, like a decorative wreath on a locked door. No drama, Mara. Just family. Paula's coming too, so maybe we can all act like adults. Cousin Paula Raines lived 20 minutes away in Hiawatha and had always believed the loudest person in a room was usually the honest one. Tessa invited her because Paula liked being asked to witness things. Nadine Mercer was invited too, but that part was Mom's doing. I knew because Tessa's voice tightened when she mentioned it. Mom insisted, she said, like Nadine was a stain on the tablecloth. I called Owen as soon as I got home. He listened, then said, Go if your mother expects you. Do not sign anything. Keep your phone on you. And make sure someone outside that house knows when you arrive. His voice was calm, but not casual. There is a difference. Before I hung up, he added, People like Brock prefer confusion. Your job is to make the facts stand still. Sunday came cold and bright. I pulled up to Mom's house at 12:10. Glenn Pritchard was across the street pretending to clear leaves from a gutter that did not have any leaves in it. He looked down from his ladder and gave me one small nod. I gave him one back. My phone was in my jacket pocket, recording before I reached the steps. In Iowa, I knew I could record a conversation I was part of. That morning, I was the party. Inside, the house smelled like reheated green bean casserole, deli ham, and Hy-Vee apple pie. Mom sat at the head of the dining table in her blue cardigan, her cane hooked over the chair beside her. She had put on lipstick, but only one side of her mouth held the color evenly. That detail nearly undid me. She had tried to look like herself, for a meeting where everyone else planned to discuss what parts of her life could be moved around. Tessa sat on Mom's left, close enough to touch her shoulder whenever the room needed, reminding who the tender daughter was. Brock did not sit. He stood near the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, arms folded, contractor polo tucked too tightly into jeans with a leather belt polished for the occasion. Paula was already eating a roll. Nadine sat across from Mom with her purse in her lap and her eyes on Brock. The papers appeared after 10 minutes of false conversation. Weather, gas prices, Paula's grandson applying to Iowa State. Then Brock reached behind the sideboard and lifted a cream-colored folder I had not seen when I walked in. He placed it beside Mom's plate and tapped it twice with 2 fingers. "This ends today," he said. Tessa leaned toward Mom, her voice soft enough to sound loving, if you did not know where to look for the blade. "Mara, please don't make Mom suffer through more uncertainty." Paula stopped chewing. Nadine's hand tightened around the strap of her purse. Mom looked from Tessa to me, then down at the folder. "Maybe if I sign," she said quietly, "everyone can stop fighting." I sat down across from her and placed both hands flat on the table so she could see they were steady. "Mom," I said, "if you want legal help, we will get you independent legal help. Someone who represents you. Not me. Not Tessa. Not Brock. You." The chair nearest Brock scraped backward when he shoved it with his knee. His face darkened. "You don't get to decide that," he said. I looked at him then. Not at his hands, not at the folder, at him. "Neither do you." The room changed after that. Not loudly. It tightened, like a storm door pulled shut before the wind hits. Brock forgot about Nadine. He forgot about Paula. He forgot about Glenn across the street, with his phone angled toward Mom's open dining room window. People like him always remember witnesses too late. Brock's eyes moved from my face to the folder, then to the small water glass beside my mother's plate. Something ugly settled behind his expression. The kind of permission a man gives himself right before he decides everyone else has mistaken his restraint for weakness. He picked up the pen from the folder and dropped it in front of me. It bounced once against the table, rolled toward the apple pie, and stopped beside the fork Mom had not touched. "Sign that you won't contest it, Mara," he said. My mother's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the napkin in her lap, twisting the white paper until it looked like a bandage. Tessa leaned closer to her, whispering something I could not hear, but her eyes stayed on me. Not on Brock. Not on the folder. Me. Like I was the one standing in the doorway with my shoulders squared and my jaw clenched. "I'm not signing anything," I said. "And neither is Mom until she has her own attorney." Brock laughed once, short and flat. "You keep saying that like you're in charge." "No," I said. "I'm saying she is." That was the sentence that broke his mask. Brock stepped around the chair nearest him, slow at first, then faster when no one stopped him. Nadine half rose from her seat. "Brock," she said, "sit down." He turned just enough to point his anger at her. "Stay out of family business." Then he faced me again. Close enough that I could see the small shaving nick under his jaw and the pulse jumping in his neck. "Sign it," he said, each word lower than the last. "Or I'll put you in the hospital before your mother finishes that glass of water." The room went silent. Paula's roll sat untouched in her hand. Nadine's face hardened. My mother looked at the glass as if it had betrayed her by existing. Water trembled against the rim. I stood slowly, because sudden movement feeds men like Brock. He straightened too, satisfied. thinking he had finally pulled me into the version of myself he could punish. "You just threatened me in front of my mother," I said. "No," he said, smiling with one side of his mouth. "I gave you motivation." Then his hand shot out and closed around my arm. Higher than the bruise from the driveway. Harder. He pulled me sideways, away from the table, away from Mom, toward the kitchen doorway where he thought fewer eyes could follow. My shoulder jolted. Mom made a small sound, not quite my name. I saw the imbalance before I felt the pain. "Let go," I said. He tightened his grip. From behind him, Tessa whispered, "Mara, don't make him angry." That was the last clean cut. Not Brock's fingers pressing into my arm. Not the threat, Tessa's voice. Soft, familiar, cowardly. In her version of the story, even the hand hurting me was somehow my responsibility. Tessa's words landed before Brock's grip did. "Don't make him angry." I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. Don't upset your sister. Don't push your mother. Don't make things harder. It was always my job to shrink first, so someone else could feel reasonable. But Brock's fingers were digging into my arm. My mother was trembling at the table, and for the first time, shrinking would not keep the peace. It would hand him the room. I looked at my mother before I moved. Not at Brock, not at Tessa, at Mom. Her face had gone pale beneath the lipstick she had tried so carefully to put on straight. Her good hand was flat against the table, as if she could hold the whole house still by pressing down hard enough. I needed her to see one thing clearly. Not rage, not revenge. Control. "I'm okay," I said, keeping my voice low. "Watch me, Mom." Brock mistook that for fear. Men like him often do. He pulled harder, trying to drag me toward the kitchen doorway, away from the table, away from Nadine's eyes and Paula's open mouth. I let him believe he had my weight for half a second. Then I changed the conversation my body was having with his. Not violently. Precisely. I turned just enough to take my balance back and remove his. His grip slipped from control into panic. He made a rough sound in his throat when his knees hit the dining room rug. The folder slid sideways on the table. The water glass tipped but did not fall. I guided him down, not through him, and kept his arm controlled against his own side. His face turned toward the floorboards my father had sanded by hand 20 years earlier. Brock gasped like humiliation had weight. It was the first honest sound he had made all afternoon. I stopped the second he stopped pulling. That mattered. I wanted every person in that room to understand the difference between violence and restraint. Brock lay on his side, breathing hard, eyes wide, with the shock of a man discovering that size was not the same thing as safety. I stepped back with both hands open where everyone could see them. "He is not hurt," I said. My voice did not shake. He put his hands on me. I made him let go. Mom started crying then, quietly. Not the way people cry in movies, but the way older women cry when they are trying not to need tissues. Nadine moved first. She went to Mom, not to Brock, and put a hand on her shoulder. Paula stared at me as if she had just realized the quiet cousin she had dismissed for years had been standing in plain sight the whole time. Tessa finally found her voice, but it came out thin. "What did you do to him?" I looked at her, really looked. "What you should have asked," I said, "is what he was doing to me." That shut her mouth. Not because she felt shame. I do not know if Tessa had enough room left in her for that. It shut her mouth because Nadine heard it. Paula heard it. Mom heard it. And across the street, Glenn's phone was still pointed toward the open dining room window, catching the silence Brock had never planned for. Brock found his phone before he found his dignity. He pushed himself upright with one hand, face flushed, hair fallen across his forehead, breathing like the room had stolen something from him. His eyes moved from me to Nadine, then to Paula, then to my mother. I watched him choose the version of events he thought would survive. Men like Brock do not apologize when the truth corners them. They look for a louder lie. "She attacked me," he said, already dialing. "I want police here now." Tessa stood beside him, with one hand hovering near his shoulder, not touching. just close enough to look loyal if anyone was watching. Mara has been under a lot of stress, she said. Her voice shook, but not from fear. From calculation arriving late. She's been overwhelmed with Mom. Maybe she just snapped. Paula looked at her then. Really looked, and for the first time all afternoon, my cousin stopped chewing on other people's certainty. The officers arrived 12 minutes later. Detective Marisol Keene came with them, though I did not know yet that Nadine had called her directly. Keene was 51, compact, gray threaded through her dark hair, with eyes that moved slowly because they did not need to hurry to catch things. Brock started talking before she crossed the threshold. He said I was unstable. He said I had attacked him without warning. He said my mother was being controlled by me, and that the family had gathered only to protect her. Detective Keene let him talk. That was the first sign she was good. She did not interrupt the performance. She let it build itself high enough to fall from. When Brock finally stopped, she turned to Mom. Not to May. Not to Tessa. To the woman whose name was on the house, the accounts, and the papers. Mrs. Whitcomb, she said, did you understand what you were being asked to sign today? Mom looked smaller in that chair than I had ever seen her. Her lipstick had faded at one corner. Nadine's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. The folder sat beside the water glass, cream-colored and clean, as if it had not been the sharpest thing in the room. Mom stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered, "They told me it was so the girls would stop fighting." No one moved. Glenn came in after that, rain jacket zipped to his chin, phone in his hand. He handed Detective Keene the video without making a speech. The recording caught Brock's threat. It caught his hand closing around my arm. It caught Tessa telling me not to make him angry. Nadine gave them my audio. I gave them the photos, the jammed printer page, the bruises, the draft naming Brock as agent. Owen Delaney arrived 20 minutes later, with copies already printed, because some people understand that timing is not drama. It is protection. By the time Detective Keene looked back at Brock, his face had changed. The red was gone. Underneath it was something pale and practical. Fear with math behind it. Owen explained what Brock had not expected anyone to find. Emails attached to a funding packet for a $1.8 million assisted living renovation, listing anticipated family property control as supporting collateral. Not ownership. Not consent. Anticipated control. Brock had come to my mother's table to turn her into a signature. Instead, his own words, his own folder, and his own hand had turned him into an investigation. 6 weeks later, Hale Premier Renovations lost the assisted living contract. Not postponed, not renegotiated, lost. The lender froze Brock's application pending review. 2 suppliers filed claims for unpaid materials, and the quiet little network of men who had called him a rising contractor stopped returning his calls. That was the part Brock never understood. Paperwork does not shout. It does not flex in doorways. It simply waits until every lie has signed its own name. Tessa came to Mom's porch on a Thursday afternoon with no lipstick, no real estate blazer, and no Brock beside her. For the first time in years, she looked less polished than tired. I was helping Mom sort mail at the kitchen table when Tessa knocked instead of walking in. That almost made me sad. Almost. She stood outside with her arms wrapped around herself, looking past me into the house like she was trying to see whether there was still a place for her in it. "You didn't have to ruin us," she said. I held the storm door open, but did not step aside. Behind me, Mom went very still. There had been a time when those words would have pulled me apart, when I would have rushed to prove I was not cruel, not selfish, not the difficult one. But some habits die the day you realize they were never love. "I didn't ruin you," I said. "I stopped you from ruining Mom." Tessa's face tightened. Tears gathered, but I no longer trusted every wet eye as proof of pain. "We're family," she whispered. I looked at the porch boards Dad had replaced after the flood of 2016, each plank sanded smooth under his hands. "Family does not mean the weakest person in the room has to pay for everyone else's mistakes," I said. She waited for me to soften. I did not. After a minute, she turned and walked back to her car. Mom hired her own attorney after that. Not Owen, someone neither daughter had chosen. She signed a medical advocate form naming me for hospital decisions, but her house, savings, and land went under a neutral fiduciary's oversight. That mattered to me. I had not fought Brock to take his place. I had fought so my mother could have a choice that belonged to her. By late November, the maple in the backyard had dropped almost all its leaves. Mom and I sat on the back porch with a resistance band looped around her foot, practicing the small upward lift her therapist wanted 10 times a day. Her cane leaned against the chair. The porch paint was peeling. The gutter still needed fixing. The house was not perfect, it was hers. Mom raised her toes half an inch, shaking with the effort. Then she smiled. "Your father would have liked that," she said. I looked at the yard, the old windows, the roof Brock had wanted to turn into collateral, and felt the quiet settle back where fear had been. True strength is not making people afraid of you. True strength is standing between someone you love and the thing trying to swallow them, and refusing to move. Sometimes the hardest lesson in life is learning that love does not require you to surrender your boundaries. For years, Mara believed being the dependable one meant absorbing everyone else's fear, anger, and mistakes. She thought peace meant staying quiet. She thought being a good daughter meant carrying the weight without asking who kept adding to it. But peace built on silence is not peace. It is just fear with better manners. Family is supposed to be the place where your weakest moments are protected, not exploited. A parent growing older should not become a bank account with a pulse. A daughter who shows up every day should not be punished because others only appear when there is something to gain. And love should never sound like pressure, never arrive as paperwork no one fully understands, never use guilt to make a frightened person sign away their own voice. What Mara learned is something many people learn too late. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is taking photos of the truth when your hands want to shake. Sometimes it is calling the lawyer, keeping your voice calm, sitting across from your mother and saying, "You still get to choose." Sometimes strength is not fighting back harder. It is refusing to become the kind of person who hurt you. And healing does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like an old porch, peeling paint, a cane leaning against a chair, and a mother lifting her foot half an inch because someone patient is sitting beside her saying, "Again." That is where real victory lives, not in revenge, not in humiliation, but in the quiet return of safety. If this story reminded you of someone who carried too much for too long, or if you have ever had to protect someone you love from people who called their control concern, share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you believe family should never be used as a weapon, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and join us for the next story. Sometimes the people who look the quietest are the ones who have survived the most.